Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Little Acts of Kindness. This will be Part 80, Chapter 80, entitled Secretaries and CEOs. Izuku gave a smile as he handed over the cup of tea to his guest. Yagi gave a grateful smile. "Thank you, my boy." He gave a nod and sat down across from his mentor, who had texted him earlier in the day asking if he could come over, which of course he had said yes to. "How have you been doing?" Yagi asked. Good, Izuku answered. "That's good, and classes aren't too hard." "No," Izuku answered, blowing on his own tea before taking a sip. The two continued talking for a little bit, All Might talking a little bit about how he found teaching English when Izuku asked. "I'll admit, it's different from training foundational heroics, but I think I actually enjoy it. It's a lot more structured, though. That could be because Yamada-kun has given me his lesson plans to follow while he's gone. Admittedly, I'm glad he's coming back tomorrow. I'm not sure I'm really cut out for teaching a standard class." Izuku's smile brightened at the mention of Yamada coming back tomorrow, glad that the teacher was coming back. "I was wondering about how your progress with One for All is coming," Yagi said. Izuku thought about it. He had, of course, practiced using One for All when he could, and he had made some progress. When he had trained under Gran Torino, his limit had been about 7 to 8%. Friday, during the heroics, he had tested his limit, and it had increased. He could now safely use about 10% of it without feeling strain. "I can use about 10%, safely," Izuku answered. Yagi smiled. "That's good. Have you had any more dreams?" Izuku shook his head. "Not any that I think are related to One for All," Izuku answered. "All right. I've been looking into the previous wielder's quirks for you, but it's taking some time to find any information." Izuku just gave a nod. The two continued to chat, Yagi telling him everything he remembered about using One for All, and everything he remembered about his mentor's quirk, Float, his aunt's quirk. It was during this conversation that there was a knock on the door. Izuku blinked, having not expected anyone. Heading over to the door, he glanced out the peephole, and then opened the door once seeing that it was his grandfather. "Hello, Izuku. I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, but I figured I'd come over." His grandfather held up a small box. "Since you were going to be at school for the next few days, training, I figured I'd cook you a nice dinner." Izuku gave a small smile, stepping aside to let his grandfather in. He still wasn't sure about the man, but he seemed nice. His grandfather entered, pausing a bit. "Yagi Toshinori, a pleasure to see you, though I admit to being curious as to why All Might's secretary is in my grandson's house." Yagi gave a slight cough, though luckily there was no blood. Yagi is my friend," Izuku answered. "He helped me train for UA." Green eyes narrowed a bit. "Is that so?" Yagi gave a nod, smiling. "Yes, I met young Midoriya a little over a year ago, and his determination to be a hero was admirable. It reminded me of many heroes I've known, and I offered my help to him." "I see," his grandfather said, his sharp gaze never leaving Yagi, who seemed to be a bit nervous. Izuku looked between the two as he shifted a bit closer to Yagi. Is everything all right?" he hesitantly asked, looking between the two. "Just fine, my boy. I'm sure Shimura-san was just surprised since he didn't know that we knew each other," Yagi said, giving a smile as he seemed to make a decision. "All Might's secretary is correct. I still have a lot of catching up to do with you, grandson," his grandfather stated, his tone slightly derisive as he called Yagi All Might's secretary, which was enough of a clue for Izuku to realize that he didn't know that Yagi was All Might's civilian identity. But it was a slight bite in Yagi's tone that surprised him. After all, when Yagi had first mentioned the CEO, he had sounded like he respected the man. Something was going on between the two, but Izuku had no idea what it could be. Right, he said. Silence fell over the apartment, an awkward silence that Izuku desperately wished would go away. So he blurted out the first thing that came to mind, which, given the civil war tomorrow, was his worries. "I don't think that I can pull off my plan successfully," he said, his stutter worse with his nervousness. "What do you mean?" Yagi asked. Just... Izuku hesitated, biting his lip. "My plan, it can work, but even with figuring out what I should say on the video, I'm not sure I can get it done without stuttering." His grandfather gave a hum. and Izuku turned his attention to the man. You said you always stutter around people, correct? Izuku gave a nod. Do you stutter when just by yourself? No, Izuku answered. Well then, when you record the video, make sure you're by yourself. That should help, right? Yes, but I have to be all... Izuku waved his hand a bit, grimacing slightly. Villain-like, even when I'm fighting and such. I see, his grandfather said, falling silent as he gave a thoughtful look. What if you were to pretend that the other kids were something or somebody else? Yagi suggested. I've tried that before, but it didn't work. Yagi gave a nod, opened his mouth, but his grandfather spoke first. When we spoke about your message, you seemed pretty good to me speaking over the phone. You didn't stutter then. What did you do before you spoke to me then? What were you thinking? Izuku frowned, thinking about it. What had he been thinking about? Slowly he recalled. He had been thinking about how the various people were believing him, that they liked him for who he was, stutters and all. The way they stood by him, how they didn't pressure him. I was thinking about the people that believe in me, Izuku whispered. It was only after he spoke that he realized he hadn't stuttered. I did it, I didn't stutter. And then he stuttered again. Izuku sighed and buried his head into his hands. Good job, my boy. It'll take some practice and time, but just remember that you have people who support you, including me, young Midoriya. Izuku gave a large smile, warmth spreading through his chest. His luck really had changed for the better. Now he had so many people supporting him and helping him. He felt tears gathering in his eyes. Thank you, both of you, he said through his tears, giving each of them a quick, heartfelt hug. It was silent for a bit, but it was a more comfortable silence. Eventually his grandfather stood up, stretching, and his back audibly popped. Well, I'm going to start cooking dinner. All right, Izuku said, watching as the man went into the kitchen, taking the food he had brought with him along. He turned to Yagi, who sighed. Well, I guess I should get going, my boy. Let you spend time with your grandfather. You take care of yourself, all right? Izuku gave a nod. May I ruffle your hair, my boy? Yes, Izuku said, granting permission, earning a smile and a hair ruffle from his mentor. I'll see you, Yagi said, as he stood up and headed to the door. Goodbye, Izuku said, giving a smile as he thought about just how much the older blonde had helped him. Blue eyes looked at him, and Yagi's smile was soft. Goodbye, young Midoriya. With that, Yagi left, the door closing shut behind him. Izuku got up and moved to the kitchen, seeing his grandfather cooking. The man gave him a nod, acknowledging his presence. A few minutes later, he gave a hum. So, how did you and Yagi-san meet? Izuku swallowed a bit before answering. We met after the slime villain, because none of the heroes had me get checked over by the paramedics. All Might sent him to check on me to make sure I was all right. I see. And you trust him? His grandfather asked. Izuku gave a nod. Yes, he's helped me so much. I wouldn't have been able to become a hero without his help. That's good. How are you feeling about being able to pull off being a villain leader? He bit his lip, thinking about it for a few moments. I think that I might be able to pull it off. His grandfather gave him a smile. That's good, but if there's anything you want to ask me, feel free, and I'll do my best to answer. Izuku gave a hum as he thought about it. Was there anything he wanted to ask? Where did you learn how to cook? His grandfather gave a startled laugh. I learned when I was a child. My father really enjoyed cooking and taught me how. I remember when I was about 9 or 10, and some friends at school learned that it was my father who did most of the cooking. And they were surprised since their mothers were the cooks. They thought cooking was girly, and I shocked them when they learned that I enjoyed cooking. My father learned to cook for my grandmother, and she had the best recipes for cookies I had tried, even to this day. His grandfather gave a fond sigh. It's a shame I've never managed to get the recipe right. I swear it's the exact same way she made them, but they just never taste the same. Maybe I should cook them for you. Would you like some cookies after dinner? Sure, Izuku agreed. He had never had cookies made for him before. His grandfather smiled. It was silent as Izuku watched his grandfather cooking, but after a minute his grandfather spoke up. "Would you like to learn?" Izuku's eyes widened. His grandfather smiled at him reassuringly. "I would love to teach you, if you want." I'd like that. I know a bit, but not much." His grandfather gestured for him to come over, and was soon telling him what he was doing and having Izuku help out. About an hour later, the meal was finished and his grandfather started to set the table. Izuku headed deeper into the apartment, finding his mom's room. Opening the door, he saw her sitting on the bed, staring vacantly out the window. "Mom, dinner's ready." She turned to look at him, giving a blink. "Grandfather is also here." She blinked again, then turned to stare out the window again, making no inclination to move. "Come on, you need to eat," Izuku said. There was no movement for the longest time, and Izuku started to turn, but eventually she got up and moved into the dining room. He followed behind her and sat down to eat with his family. It was mostly silent, his grandfather trying and failing to get any response out of his mom. His eyes pained each time he failed. Finally, he gave up and turned to speak with Izuku. "What's to happen with Inko while you're doing your training exercise?" "Mitsuki Bakugo will watch over her for me. She does so whenever I have to be away from the house for more than a day." "I see. Well, if she's ever busy or needs anyone else to look after Inko, I can take care of her. I would offer to primarily take care of her, but—" He glanced at her, with sorrowful green eyes. "It isn't what she would want." Dinner was a mostly silent affair, as they finished eating, his mom immediately returning to her room as soon as her dish was empty. It took Izuku and his grandfather a bit longer. But soon they were finished cleaning up the dishes. Once the dishes were in the drying rack, his grandfather gave a hum, looking through his supplies. "I'll have to go out to get the milk and eggs, but other than that, it looks like you have everything needed to make the cookies. I'll be back in a few minutes." It took his grandfather only 20 minutes to return, and soon the man was instructing him on how to make the cookies. All too soon, the smell of cookies was permeating the house, making Izuku's mouth water. He watched the cookies eagerly, waiting for them to turn golden brown, as his grandfather instructed. When they did, his grandfather pulled them out of the oven, and then they had to wait for them to cool. The cookies smelled so good, and Izuku felt his mouth watering. Fresh baked cookies. He had never had them before. His mom had never made them from scratch, always getting store-bought cookies. When the cookies finished cooling, his grandfather grabbed a paper towel, putting a cookie in it and handing it over. "Here you go, grandson." Izuku took a hesitant bite of it and smiled, eyes watering at the taste. It was so good. "It's the best cookie I've ever had," Izuku murmured, not even realizing that he didn't stutter. His grandfather gave a smile that looked a bit sad, reaching over and ruffling Izuku's hair. Izuku didn't even flinch, and leaned into the touch as he took another bite of the cookie. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 80 of Little Acts of Kindness. Chapter 81 will be up next. Let me know your all's thoughts or reactions to this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.